Okay, I assume we're live here. Welcome to this critical panel discussion, The Threats of AI and Disinformation in Times of Global Crises. My name is William Yeomans, and I'm an associate professor at George Washington University. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of GW's Institute for Middle East Studies. We're honored to co-host this discussion with the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. We find ourselves at a pivotal moment in history where technology, specifically artificial intelligence, is reshaping the landscape of information dissemination and consequently how we perceive reality. AI is both a tool for great potential and a weapon of significant peril. Now, when thinking about these dystopian pictures of the present, I'm reminded of the grave and ongoing conflict in Gaza, where the stakes are incredibly high and the consequences of disinformation are dire. The Israeli war on Gaza not only inflicts physical devastation on people, on cities, but also perpetuates misleading narratives meant to cast doubt, confusion, obscure truth, blame the victims. In such volatile times, the proliferation of false information exacerbates man-made catastrophes like the one that Israel is perpetuating in Gaza. Our discussion today aims to explore the multifaceted nature of AI and disinformation and the broader implications for human security and the possibilities of progress. We are privileged to have with us a distinguished panel of experts who bring deep insights from various fields, including technology, media, policy, and human rights. So I want to thank you for joining us. And right now I'm going to turn it over to our panel moderator, Tamara Kharoub, the Deputy Executive Director and Senior Fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Will, and thanks for this introduction. We are certainly glad to be co-hosting this event with the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. This is an ongoing partnership between our two institutions, and thanks to Shana Marshall at the Institute and my colleague Lana Kaptan at Arab Center for making this collaboration happen, and we look forward to more collaborations in the future. I'll be chairing this discussion on the threats of artificial intelligence and disinformation in times of global crises. Thanks to all of you for joining us for this very important conversation, especially at a time when the genocide in Gaza continues and is being enabled by the information and technology industries. Over the last 8 months of Israel's war on Gaza, we've seen a significant increase in disinformation and the intensified use of artificial intelligence in automated warfare. Israel's war has exposed the numerous methods of digital dehumanization and deception, and has shown some of the worst manifestations of the threats of technology that can result in tech-driven atrocities and justifications for war crimes. Today's discussion covers two distinct but overlapping aspects of the dangers of technology during major global crises. One is disinformation or digital deception, and the second is the use of artificial intelligence or AI. In times of major events like the war on Gaza, accurate information and documentation are essential, not only for decision-making and shaping public opinion, but also for accountability efforts and measures for seeking justice. In this sense, and in the context of the Gaza war, disinformation and propaganda, and this includes anti-Palestinian racism and dehumanization and incitement, have had deadly consequences and have driven decision-making that justifies and enables war crimes and crimes against humanity. This has been happening for the last 8 months, but have also led to the massacres in Rafah over the last few days, as Israel dropped several 2,000-pound bombs on sleeping refugees in tents, the majority of whom are children. Meanwhile, the information and media elites continue to try to spin and whitewash the atrocities committed by Israel and to justify and support those crimes. While propaganda is not new, especially at times of war, the speed with which it spreads in the digital era and the extent to which this type of content is amplified by social media platforms and algorithms is unprecedented. And this goes along with the lack of systematic fact-checking and verification measures. Additionally, and as Will mentioned, AI tools have enabled the automation of warfare and human rights abuses. Mass surveillance technologies, predictive algorithms, and AI targeting systems have been extensively used by Israel to subjugate and kill innocent Palestinians in Gaza and also in the West Bank. These systems that Israel have used include projects like Lavender and Hapsara, among many others. The increasingly computerized and data-driven approaches to war threaten the lives and rights of people worldwide, especially those vulnerable populations and marginalized groups. So today's discussion will focus on the case of Israel's war on Gaza as tech-driven atrocities continue to take place as we speak, but will also address the wider implications of the uses of such technologies in other contexts and their impacts on human rights and securities and protections worldwide. We are very pleased to have with us a very excellent panel of experts to address these issues and answer some of the questions. I will introduce them in speaking order. Mark Owen Jones is Associate Professor of Middle East Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, and he's also the author of the book titled Digital Authoritarianism in the Middle East, Deception, Disinformation, and Social Media. Marwa Fatafta is the MENA Policy and Advocacy Director at Access Now, and is also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Sausan Abu Eid is the coordinator for the Arms Division at Human Rights Watch. And Laura Nolan is a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control and a founding member of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to contribute to this important discussion. We will do 2 rounds of questions, and we'll give each panelist about 5 to 6 minutes per round for their interventions, and then we can take some questions from the online audience. Before we start, I would like to remind our audience that you can send in your questions at any time during the discussion. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom, or for those watching on our website and social media platforms, you can send in your question by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. Again, that's events@arabcenterdc.org. Please identify yourself and your affiliation and indicate to whom your question is addressed, and we will try to take as many questions as possible. And with that, we will start the discussion and hear from our expert panelists. In the first round, I'd like to maybe discuss some of the problems and dangers of technology in global crises. And we'll start with Mark. Mark Owen Jones. I want to ask you about the disinformation landscape when it comes to Israel's war on Gaza. What types of tactics and disinformation propaganda are we seeing on social media platforms specifically? Which accounts and disinfluencers are spreading this type of disinformation? What are the methods of digital deception, psychological operations, or political influence campaigns are taking place? And just to follow up on that, maybe a little bit on what are the impacts and the real world or deadly consequences of this disinformation? We've seen, the widespread lies about the beheaded babies or the Hamas command center or disinformation about UNRWA, and we know that they've had some serious, dire consequences on the people of Gaza. Mark?
Thank you very much for the introduction, Tamara, and it's great to be here with so many esteemed panelists. I've got 5 minutes, so I'll try and answer the questions as best as I can in that time. Firstly, though, I want to talk about the term deception just briefly, because I think deception is a good way of capturing the different things that you've mentioned, especially when it comes to propaganda and disinformation. So I sort of talk about deception as the willful manipulation of the information space through erroneous content and manipulated forms of distribution with the intent to cause some form of harm through demonization, adversarial content, omission, misdirection, whitewashing, or influencing information availability in the service of political power maintenance, in this case, in the service of occupation and apartheid. So I think what I want to start talking about, I'll sort of talk about chronologically in a way, because I think there's a narrative in terms of how Israel has used disinformation in the course of this genocide. And you mentioned one of them, which was the discourse about the beheaded babies. And I think the beheaded babies is a very good example of how disinformation and deception emanates from Israel. The reason being is because when we think about digital disinformation, it's easy to think of digital disinformation in its own ecosystem, social media. But actually, I think in the modern disinformation world, we have to look at how the digital interacts with the traditional. And I think the beheaded babies was a very good example of that, because what we saw that story sort of leaked in an interview in legacy media that was then reported online, which then went viral online, and in the subsequent day appeared on the front page of numerous newspapers, including in the UK. I'm not sure about the United States, but this story that 40 beheaded babies, it was unverified, but it went viral very early on. That's obviously false in itself, but the question is why, right? And, disinformation is rarely accidental. In fact, the point is it's intentful, right? So what's the point of the 40 beheaded babies? Well, it ties in with the whole social media campaign that was also going on at the same time around after October the 7th, which was Hamas equals ISIS. Right? What is Hamas equals ISIS? Obviously, it's an attempt to conflate Hamas with the Islamic State. Why? Because I think the Islamic State are generally agreed by most people to be a particularly brutal entity. And obviously, to conflate those two things, Hamas, who have a very different modus operandi and political history to ISIS, as the same thing, is part of this deliberate propaganda tactic. And if you have the story of beheaded babies, that's designed to try and reify, to kind of legitimize this narrative of Hamas equals ISIS. The point being, obviously, ISIS are brutal. Who kills babies? Who beheads babies? It's brutal. And I think this is a very clear attempt to play off existing anti-Islamic tropes, which is another really important part of this, and anti-Palestinian in particular, but also disinformation. It tries to resource other prejudices, right? Especially with Israel, because Israel is also trying to mobilize the sentiments of the demographics of its main ally, the United States and Europe. And how does it do that? Well, it's playing this very dangerous game now where it's inflaming Islamophobic tension, playing on these Islamic tropes of barbaric Muslims, uncivil Muslims, and weaponizing that, right? That's why it's saying this beheaded babies. It's saying, of course, who beheads babies? Muslims, ISIS, right? So it's leveraging these kind of prejudices to inflame tensions elsewhere in order to legitimize its cause. And I think that's a really important underlying aspect of how Israel's disinformation has played out in this case. And why is that? Well, Israel now have killed over 35,000 people, most of whom are women and children. When you keep killing that many people, especially, when we saw what happened on October the 7th, with the death of over 1,000 Israelis, you can only, how do you sustain the killing of people and try to keep public opinion on your side? Well, you have to try and legitimize that the fact that your people you're killing are somehow deserve to die. And this is another really strong aspect, I would say, of Israeli disinformation. They are trying hard to try and create a parity between the genocidal violence that they are committing and the fewer number of Israelis who have died. And that's not to minimize the number of Israelis who died, but it's simply to say that you cannot compare 35,000 with 1,000 or a Nakba. And they're trying to create a parity through this. This is why the tropes of beheading babies, right? Because everyone sees the killing of children as a fundamentally a barbaric thing. And we've seen this kind of propaganda being used since World War I, where it said that German soldiers would kill babies. And I think the way this narrative is outlined, I think is particularly interesting. And I'll talk about it a bit more, maybe in round two, because I'm aware that I'm running out of time, is that as Israel killed more and more children, then the disinformation landscape changes, right? So how does the country who started off from October 7th, talking about the brutality of Hamas killing babies, then deal with the fact that they've killed thousands and thousands of Palestinian children? Well, this I think was emblematic in one particular interesting disinformation campaign that we saw coming out of Israel, which was the activity around Al-Shifa Hospital, right? We saw that time where a number of official Israeli accounts shared a video of a nurse pretending to be a Palestinian nurse, talking about how, Hamas wouldn't let them leave the hospital. There's all this kind of type of thing, right? And that, again, Hamas were the ones responsible for Palestinian deaths. It's always gaslighting. We saw that. And then we saw, the official Israeli accounts who are, again, a really important part of official Israeli disinformation, sharing this cartoon where they had a picture of an Israeli baby and a picture of a Hamas baby being poured and filled with different things. The Israeli baby was being poured with love, and the Palestinian baby was being poured with a jug marked hatred in Arabic. And then, it's sort of one saying that, well, the children in Palestine are raised to be hateful, whereas the Israeli children are raised to be full of love. And then what you have in the sequence that a few days later, you have Israel announcing that they find a copy of Mein Kampf in Gaza, obviously Hitler's autobiography, meant to be the epitome of anti-Semitism. Not only did they find that book, but they said that they found it in a child's room, right? So for me, what this is trying to do is not just saying that, well, if you can't justify killing children, you have to try and create a narrative saying that the children you're killing are somehow worth killing. And how do you do that? Well, you dehumanize them through this propaganda. And the use of children, I think, in disinformation and deception and propaganda is a small component, a tiny component of what we've seen. And the narrative of it has changed in accordance with how many people Israel have been killing. That's one small component. And I'll talk about others afterwards, but I know that's my 5 minutes, so I'll just pass the baton now, and thank you, and leave it there to open.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm sure there's a lot to be said, and we'll come back to that. But I think this idea of the willful manipulation of information and use of disinformation to legitimize the war and justify killing children is a very important note here. And next, the one part of this manipulation of the information environment is disinformation, and the second part is the silencing of alternative voices or narratives. And here I would like to move on to Marwa and maybe talk a little bit more about social media censorship and shadow banning as a form of disinformation and information control. We've seen, the content moderation practices, shadow banning, censorship of different social media platforms that have impacted to some extent, I would have to say, but they have impacted the Palestinian content on social media platforms. And if you could also touch a little bit more on TikTok specifically, because it's been it has become the place for people to seek information about what is happening on the ground in Gaza, up until recently when we've seen a bit of a shift in the policies of TikTok. Maybe this was after the senior leaders were invited to meet with the Israeli president, but also the U.S. ban, or in other words, the forcing the sale of TikTok within a year is being presented as more about Israel than about China, really. So if you could talk about some of these issues, that would be great. Marwa.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tamara, and happy to be here. And before I delve into that question, to your example, Mark, for a while I kept a list of things that the IDF would find in Palestinian children homes. I think they found weapons under their bed, in kindergartens, in teddy bears. It's really quite hilarious, if not scary, the level of dehumanization they're doing online in service of genocide. But to your question, Tamara, so I think by now it's very clear and well evidenced the extent to which social media companies over-moderate Palestine-related content and disproportionately target Palestinian voices. We saw that during the protest of Sheikh Jarrah and the ensuing Gaza war in May 2021. But the aftermath of the October 7th attack has taken the censorship to unprecedented and also global levels, impacting not only Palestinian voices, but also those who are advocating for their rights around the world. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, social media companies had a zealous reaction towards removing as much content as possible coming from Gaza. So, for example, TikTok removed more than 925,000 videos from the region, from the Middle East, between October 7th and 31st. Similarly, X removed over 350,000 content. Meta, which really has is the leader of big tech in silencing Palestinian voices, has removed over 800,000 posts in the 3 first days of the attack. And they even tweaked and tinkered with their algorithms in order to automatically remove and hide what they consider to be inflammatory content coming from Palestine specifically. Now, according to these platforms, they're removing terrorist content, right? But we know from research and also from experience that those systems, or the content moderation systems of these platforms, are so flawed at scale that these numbers that I shared contain speech that is protected under the right to freedom of expression. You know, just to give you a few examples, and there are really many. The word shaheed, which, you know, means martyr in English, although it's not an accurate translation, accounts for the most content takedowns across Meta's platforms and across all of their content moderation policies. Now, you can only imagine when Meta relies significantly, up to 98% of their content moderation decisions, on automation, on algorithms that don't understand nuance, how much of that content is basically Palestinians referring or sharing news about their relatives and their loved ones that have been killed by the Israeli occupation forces, just simply because they use the word shaheed. Similarly, you know, we've seen examples of, you know, horrendous footage of dead bodies that killed Palestinians or injured Palestinians on hospital beds and floors being flagged and marked as violating Instagram's policies of nudity and sexual activity. So these are examples where, because of the discriminatory and the flawed nature of these systems, such content is being removed. Now, this censorship not only infringes on Palestinians' rights to freedom of expression, the right to online assembly, the right to non-discrimination. It, you know, as Mark already shared, it provides a breeding ground for the proliferation of Israeli war propaganda and disinformation. And here I want to zoom out a bit and provide the wider context that, you know, in order for us to understand the far-reaching and dangerous implications of online platform censorship. You know, one, we know that since October 7th, Israel pretty much has cast a reign of terror over what Palestinians say and do online. You know, hundreds of Palestinians have been arrested because of what they shared on social media. We still continue to hear reports of Palestinians in the West Bank being stopped at military checkpoints and their devices confiscated and, you know, beaten to a pulp because they shared something about Gaza. Also, as early as October 7th, the Israeli military targeted and destroyed Palestinian internet infrastructure in Gaza. So pretty much since October 7th up until this point, we're talking about a connectivity level across the entire Gaza Strip of 20%. And we've documented 14 full communication blackouts. So the information coming out of Gaza, you know, it's circulating online despite the censorship, but that is only a fraction of what we know, and as a fraction of war crime and atrocity crimes documentation. Not to mention, of course, the fact that Israel is barring entry of foreign journalists and international media to the Gaza Strip. They've killed over 107 Palestinian journalists. You know, according to CPJ, 75% of the journalists killed worldwide in 2023 are from Gaza, and the numbers from Palestinian orgs are actually much higher. They're estimated actually at 140 journalists. And then, you know, there's Israeli cyber unit is also active. You know, they've been submitting tens of thousands of requests to TikTok and Meta in order for them to remove pro-Palestinian content. There are state-sponsored or state-affiliated pro-Israeli apps and crowdsourcing platforms whose mission is to basically direct pro-Israeli actor, I wouldn't, volunteers to mass report pro-Palestinian content on the platform. So all of that context, the banning of Al Jazeera, the confiscation of the AP devices, all of that allows, of course, the Israeli, or at least the Israeli government hopes that it can fully control information flows coming outside of Gaza, and therefore design and manipulate the ongoing narrative about the war to its advantage. And here, of course, social media platforms are not only complacent in that, manipulation, but they're also, the other side of the coin is that they're allowing this disinformation to remain on the platforms. They're allowing for, we've seen the use of targeted advertising. They're profiting from Israeli targeted ads. They're profiting from inflammatory content, from incitement to genocide, from the dehumanization of Palestinians and hate speech. And even though, we've been, as civil society organization, we have been in constant engagement with them. We've sent so many requests for explanations, but the status quo remains as is, that Palestinians continue to be censored and silenced disproportionately. Now, to the point on TikTok, it's quite interesting for me, the allegations made by U.S. lawmakers and the White House about how TikTok has been used to whitewash American youth and influence their opinions, while on the one hand, all social media platforms maintain a black box in terms of how they curate content, right? Like all of what we see on our news feeds is not organic, it's curated. What gets to be made viral or demoted, you talked about shadow banning. The demotion of Palestinian content is just another insidious way of censorship that you really can't put a finger on. You can't, as a user, tell the platform, you are taking an action against my content or against my account. But so to say that TikTok has the same business model as US social media companies, the claim that it's being influenced by the Chinese government is a claim that the US Congress has failed to substantiate, or even the Biden administration. And the reality is, yes, I mean, TikTok is popular among young people. That's just a fact. But TikTok is also not, pro-Palestinian at all. It's not like Palestine friendly. It also has removed content of Palestinian journalists. It also allows for Israeli users to live stream their torture of Palestinian detainees and them having fun in the Gaza Strip committing crimes. So, we need to keep that in perspective, that from my opinion, what the US doing vis-a-vis TikTok is more related to competition and the cold tech war it has with China. I think it's not sitting well, not only among the US government, but also among big tech, which are lobbying big time, that a Chinese platform is rising in popularity and is among at least the youth is leading the way. So I think the Gaza story is just adding fuel to the fire, if you may. I don't believe that TikTok is necessarily lending a hand to the Palestinian cause. It's just an organic use of platforms. And to end here, the war on Gaza is really, it just breaks a human comprehension, the level of brutality, the level of on every measure, in terms of the level of destruction, the level of mass slaughter, things that have been pretty much unseen or unrecorded since World War II. And so it's natural for people to protest online and share information online. And if TikTok is the app of choice for the youth, so that's just an organic choice that is not necessarily related to manipulation. So I'll stop here and I'll give it back to you, Tamara.
Thank you, Marwa. Again, there's a lot to say, but this was a great overview, and I think it's clear in terms of the full control of the information flows out of Gaza that Israel is trying to impose. And at the same time, we see social media platforms censoring Palestinian content while promoting hate speech against Palestinians and Israeli disinformation and the celebration of killing of Palestinian children. And the Israelis on social media boasting about how many children they've killed, and all of this content remains online. Now we'll switch gear a little bit and move to the second main theme that we're talking about for the first round, and with Sausan Abu Eid. Sausan, if you could just pick up from here and talk a little bit more about the notion of digital dehumanization in terms of the use of autonomous weapons, whether it's AI enabled or AI targeting, drones, algorithms that are being used, and what are their implications for human rights in general, but also for Palestinian rights and lives in particular. If you could comment on Israel's use of AI targeting systems like Lavender, which also turns out to be using WhatsApp as one of the indicators of digital behaviors, but also the system called Habsara, among many others, which has been described as a mass assassination factory. So it'd be great if you could also comment on these systems. Sausan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tamara, and thank you for having me, and thanks, Mark and Marwa, for getting us started off. And just to build off of sort of Marwa's last point about this unprecedented number or scale of civilian death that we're seeing now in Gaza, I think one thing to keep in mind is that, we are now entering more than 230 days since the start of the war in Gaza. And one thing that sort of this war stands out when we compare it to the past decades of wars on Gaza is that in the previously we're seeing around 30 to 40% of civilian harm, right? Compared to now what we're seeing is more close to 60% in this war. And one of the main explanations for this insurmountable or this vast amount of civilian death is Israel's use of AI target generation tools, such as Lavender, Gospel, and Where's Daddy. And what this has allowed Israel to do is to essentially generate a extensive list of targeting of targets that are then increasing the pace of its operations in Gaza. And what we all know that in November of 2023, 972 and Local Call published an investigative report that documented these three digital tools that were used by the IDF in Gaza. The first being Lavender, which was a tool that assigns ratings to people across Gaza related to their suspicions or their suspected affiliation with armed groups. And then the Hasbara, or the Gospel, which is a tool that generated this list of non-human targets, such as buildings or homes or other structures to be attacked. And then there's also the tool Where's Daddy, which is a system that essentially determines when these alleged combatants have returned to their family homes so that they could be attacked. And while these reports are very dystopian and very shocking, one thing to keep in mind is that this is not necessarily the first time that Israel has used AI in its wars in Gaza, while this is probably what we'd consider to be the most extensive. Now, the use of AI in military targeting potentially goes back to around 2019. But we do know that the groundwork for these AI-enabled tools have, in different systems of automation, have been laid very much in the past. For example, we know that the Israeli intelligence unit 8200, who have developed the algorithm for Gospel, are stated to have analyzed data that they have gathered from signals, whether that be phone signals, WhatsApp signals, and human and geographical intelligence, satellite imagery, drone feeds, facial recognition technologies, and other sources to build a tool that can or is able to generate these lists of targets. And this is the same unit that in 2014 published an open letter saying that their unit, 8200, was engaged in what they described as a mass surveillance of Palestinians. Now, we do know that over the past couple of years that this surveillance and mass data collection project has become more and more evident. And we saw this not just with the use of surveillance drones that were deployed across the West Bank cities, but also with the extensive use of the CCTV cameras and also the high-tech intrusive tools such as Wolfpack system, which I know, Marwa, you've written about, and also tomorrow you guys have hosted the seminar on last year. And any AI generative or algorithms that are the basis of these tools do require large amounts of data, and oftentimes this data is intrusively obtained. And this is something that the community advocating against these weapon systems has been sort of waving the flag on for so long. And it's a very short path from the collection
Sun?
Action in the use of these.
We're losing you a bit.
Oh wow. Okay. Says my connection is a bit unstable.
Okay, we can hear you well now. So if you want to just continue.
Okay. So like I was saying about the gathering of surveillance, and this all leads to, the eventual development of autonomous weapon systems and what we describe as a frightening trend towards digital dehumanization. Now, the term digital dehumanization specifically is a term that was coined by the Stop Killer Robots campaign. And what it is it is described as a process where humans are reduced to data, which is then used to make decisions and or take actions that are negatively impact their lives. And this term, essentially what it does is it serves as a framework for how we can understand how these emerging technologies, such as machines equipped with autonomous or semi-autonomous decision-making capabilities, can then reinforce and reproduce the systems of harm that we found already manifesting across societies. Now, Israel's current reliance on these AI-based targeting generation tools, such as the Gospel or the Lavender, we would say was not only just increasing the tempo of the Israeli strikes that we're seeing across Gaza, but and contributing in turn to the vast amounts of civilian harm, but they also highlight this process of digital dehumanization. Now, by reducing humans to data points and flagging them based off of a combination of features or behaviors, what these tools are able to do is that they're able to generate targets at a pace that we have not seen before. And I think it was something about like 12,000 targets were generated within just the first 27 days of the war. Now, while these tools specifically, like Lavender and Gospel, would not be categorized as autonomous weapon systems, and this is based off of the two-tier definition of the ICRC, which states that autonomous weapon systems are systems that both select and apply force to targets without human intervention. And these tools we know are used to operate, and they have what we call a human in the loop. Now, while they do have a human in the loop, this human oversight, it fails to match necessarily the pace and the scale of the target outputs that these tools are generating, which makes it very difficult to fully vet the target's output, and also adds the potential for automation bias, which is the tendency not necessarily to challenge the system's output due to our over-reliance on and trust on computers. Now, when we look specifically at autonomous weapon systems, there are a couple challenges that we know of under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And Human Rights Watch has published many reports on this, specifically since 2012. Now, first, what we do know is that once we do allow machines to select and attack targets without human control, this would be fundamentally incompatible with the principles of both distinction and proportionality under international humanitarian law. Now, these weapons would find it difficult to distinguish between what we call civilians and combatants, especially when the two mix together, and because they would lack, the human capabilities to interpret subtle cues, etc. But they would also lack the human judgment to determine when the amount of civilian harm is excessive in relation to the perceived or anticipated military advantage. And this is especially the case when we have rapidly changing case-by-case situations. Now, there's also the challenge of assigning personal accountability to these weapons. Now, when these weapons do select and engage targets, it's hard to say who should be held responsible for this. And this is what we describe as an accountability gap. And accountability is important within international humanitarian law to deter further unlawful acts, but also not just that, but also to punish past ones and to recognize the victim's suffering. Now, when we shift gears and look specifically underneath international human rights law, what we see is that these weapon systems also raise serious concerns to the fundamental right to life, to remedy, and to the principle of human dignity. And the principle of human dignity we describe it as both a legal and a moral concept that explains that, that sets that everyone deserves respect. And as an innate object, machines don't necessarily have the ability to comprehend the value of human life, but also the significance of its loss. And I will stop there, and we'll get into sort of the challenge or ways to counter these challenges next.
Thank you, Sausan, for this very enlightening yet alarming overview. And the issue of the accountability gap, I think, is very important, and we'll get back to that in the second round. But now we'll zoom out a little bit and look at the larger role of the tech industry and big tech. And we move on to Laura Nolan. Lara, you resigned from Google over its Project Maven at the time, and now we have another Google project, Project Nimbus, that's getting also a lot of attention. Could you talk a little bit more, first in general, about the involvement of big tech in the military-industrial complex and supplying lethal autonomous weapons or killer robots? How are companies like Google, but also Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, they have contracts with billions of dollars with military establishments. How are they contributing to war crimes and violations of international law? And if you could talk a little bit more about Google's Project Nimbus in Israel as well, that would be great. Laura?
Certainly, yes. But first, I'm going to correct a tiny bit of disinformation in my original intro, which is I'm not a founder of the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. The organization ICRAC that I'm a member of is. So you mentioned that I left Google as a result of Google's involvement in Project Maven. And the reason I did that was because it made me feel personally very much like I was being made complicit in war crimes, in targeting killing strikes, and also in mass surveillance. And it does very much seem like the same thing may be happening with Project Nimbus. It's very hard to know the specifics of what is occurring with Project Nimbus because there's quite a bit of secrecy. So even back in the days of Project Maven, the US tenders for that project were a little bit less secretive than the Israeli tenders for Nimbus have been, and they spelled out in a little bit more detail what the project was intended to do. The Nimbus tenders do not give as much detail as that. So we can only basically infer what would be sort of possible for the big cloud companies, Google and Amazon, to be providing. And that could be everything from automated translation to sort of sentiment analysis over bodies of text, and even potentially target identification. We don't know if systems like Lavender or Hapsura might be running on these cloud services. It's certainly possible. So one of the things that we have to think about is what are the business incentives of these big cloud companies? They want to sell compute. Their business is to sell programs that are going to use up as many CPU cycles and as much memory and so forth as possible. And one of the most compute intensive applications out there are surveillance and surveillance related activities such as processing images, video, audio. These are hugely compute intensive and they generate very nice big cloud bills for these big cloud companies. So surveillance is very good for their business. And of course, surveillance is the fundamental building block that you need in order to be able to run systems that are doing things like predictive policing and, of course, these kinds of automated targeting systems that we're seeing emerging. So I think it's highly likely that systems that are being provided by Google and by Amazon are instrumental in some fashion in either running these systems or in the collection and data cleaning processes for these systems. We don't know, but I think it's highly likely. Even in the day 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when Maven was happening, gosh, even 7 years ago, 2017, it was a more innocent time. So it was possible to go hunting internally in Google and find mailing lists and documents and code repositories that related to that project. Since then, the cloud company executives have learned some things. They have learned to lock down all of the information related to these military projects because they know that staff internally are interested in these things. And this is why I think less detail is coming out about these kinds of systems. The other thing I wanted to say as well is regarding what we know about these companies being complicit in war crimes and violations of international law, there is a very big gap in international law. I mean, I think we can very clear. I personally think that international law is very clearly being violated in Gaza currently. But more broadly, when we think about all these military and surveillance systems, there is no clear international law on proportionality as it relates to mass surveillance happening over a population in the long term. And it's a gap. I think there are huge harms from mass surveillance alone, even without the ongoing violence that it goes along with it, and it sort of destroys the fabric of society and goes beyond the specific individuals that are targeted. So while it's not the most burning concern at the moment, there is a very significant long-term concern about the sheer existence of these kinds of systems, even outside of the context of the ongoing current extreme violence. And we have no transparency coming from either the military side or from the tech company side. And I think that's really significant because I'm thinking back, 15, 20 years ago when we were seeing the early days of the move towards targeted killing. There was a very, very intentional and very structured, very slow trickle of information about those systems that occurred during those years. And that really served to normalize what was a significant step away from the existing prevailing norms of the conflict at that time. There was a norm to not use these kinds of individual targeting systems or targeting tactics. And right now, we currently have a norm that we do not automate target selection. Is that norm going to be slowly crumbled over the next several years as a result of this sort of slow trickle of information about these systems? I think it could happen, and I'm very concerned about it. So all that is to say, we don't know, but we're very concerned. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And what you mentioned about the gap in international law when it comes to these systems and the lack of transparency, I think is a good transition into the second round of the discussion here, where I'd like to hear a bit more from all of you about some recommendations on how to address these issues, but also because the first round was a bit short, I'll give each of you an opportunity to add to your previous comments and maybe comment on the other panelists' interventions, and then maybe provide some sort of recommendations or assessment of the legal international frameworks that exist or the need for these frameworks to exist. And again, we'll do the same order. We'll start with Mark as well. If you could, you're also, I wanted to give you a chance to continue your previous intervention if there's something you want to add, but also just some assessment of the recommendations. I know for a while there was this hype about decentralized social media platforms, and we saw Blue Sky and Mastodon, but they didn't really seem to take off. And there's still a question of, where does accountability lie in those contexts? So if you want to also address those, that would be good. Mark, go ahead. You're
muted. Yes. I caught myself. Yeah, I'm muted. Okay. Yes, I think everyone said so many interesting things, and I would love to respond to them. But there's also a lot to say about disinformation that I didn't get time to. But I think to blend those 2 points of trying to say what I was intending to say, and also maybe talk down the way of solutions, it depends on the particular problem, right? And when we look at disinformation and dishonesty, manipulation, there's all sorts of elements there where things could be addressed, right? You mentioned decentralization. That's just one aspect of it. But let's take like a particular campaign, right? UNRWA, right? So the United Nations entity responsible for essentially, living infrastructure in Gaza. They've been systematically attacked with disinformation by Israel, right? So Israel claimed that some of their members were terrorists, and they were involved in October the 7th. They haven't provided any evidence. Okay, there's no evidence. That's disinformation. I mean, on what basis are we expected to believe that? And that disinformation is then used to legitimize various actions, right? So if we were talking about that disinformation then caused the US, the UK, I think Australia, a bunch of other countries to stop funding UNRWA, is that the result of the disinformation? Is that a transparency issue? because we are now like looking at, the UK government saying, oh, the Israelis have told us that there's this funding. I mean, we don't know. We don't, as civil society, beyond our OSINT and other sources, have the ability to vet that. So how do we control that? Well, that's the transparency issue, right? That's a not taking Israel's word for it issue. But then you look at that anti-UNRWA campaign, it manifests in other forms. I documented the use of fake accounts online, fake Facebook pages, fake Facebook groups, spreading this disinformation, right? That's platform manipulation. That's also a Facebook and Twitter problem. And again, we know from what Marwa was saying very clearly that not only do they not do enough when it comes to platform safety that they've disinvested from, but when it comes to Israel-Palestine, there's inherent bias there. So then it needs to be more done on the platform regulation side when it comes to countering falsehoods, especially falsehoods that are intended to actually result in the harm of people. And in this case, I would say, make an entity complicit in genocide, because if you're trying to destroy and attack the very organization that's so important in feeding and providing for our population, there's a level of complicity there, right? So what other forms of legislation can you draw on in terms of trying to say that you're aiding and abetting forms of either dehumanizations or removing the life chances of the population? I think we need to be stronger in how we look at these disinformation campaigns, because I don't think people might talk about it loosely as a free speech issue. But no, I do think we talk about hate speech, we talk about, racist incitement. If we talk about information designed to starve a group of people, that is serious. And so I think that needs to be taken into account. And even now, I think from 2 days ago, if you Google UNRWA, you'll see that Israel are once again paying for ads, spreading disinformation about UNRWA. Why are Google allowing a country whose prime minister is probably going to be issued a warrant by the ICC for crimes against humanity, has been told by the ICJ to stop current military action in Rafah? Why are they allowing that country to pay for political ads? And presumably, I've yet to see a situation where Google have advertised in the same way as they allow Israel to advertise. I mean, when Amnesty issued their report calling Israel an apartheid state, Israel did the same, and they advertised on Google, smearing Amnesty International, an internationally recognized human rights organizations. These, to me, are just violations of existing policies of political advertising. And, in some cases, there are these rules that are meant to help stop disinformation, but they're so poorly enforced. And it comes down to this other issue. And it ties in a bit with, I think, what Laura and Susan were saying about kind of human oversight of AI systems. That's important. But one of the problems here is human beliefs themselves. To what extent has the pro-Israel bias we've seen in some institutions, organizations in the US actually been one of the problems in trying to not enforce existing laws or norms, right? The ICC is going to probably issue warrants for the arrest of Netanyahu. The US and the UK have called that, an outrageous decision. So how can we expect people to enforce the rules and regulations about disinformation when they are throwing the international rules-based order under the bus, right? So the whole kind of mechanisms and mechanics we have for creating these rules and regulations are being ridiculed by the very institutions and countries that claim to be at the vanguard of this rules-based order. So it's really problematic. And there are these methods, but I just wanted to make the point that, yes, we can talk about rules, regulations, and laws, but at the same time, we are living this exceptional issue, and the exceptional issue is how Western powers deal with Israel. And this is increasingly clear that the rules-based order is being undermined by this particular relationship. And I think that is always going to pose the challenges. And I just wanted to use the anti-UNRWA campaign as an example of some of the different issues and challenges that it comes to when we see this disinformation. Just one more note on the human element as well. And I think the oversight of AI, I was struck when I was reading about Habzora and Lavender, is that when at the beginning of, soon after October the 7th, in the reporting done on this, it was mentioned that the operators who had to select targets were under increasing pressure to find more targets. So what did they do? They moved the slider on the software that allows target selection, presumably to reduce the threshold by who's seen as viewed as a Hamas member. And all that does show is that human oversight, when there's that political pressure, in this case, political pressure from an entity to take revenge on Palestinians, all that's doing is forcing the human operator to actually lower their threshold for who they deem as a valid target. So even, when it comes to genocidal violence, when it comes to ethnic cleansing, any human who's in that kind of context in using these software is also going to, in theory, or is vulnerable to the same prejudices that perpetuate that genocide. So the human control aspect is not always, unfortunately, a good oversight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And that's an important point about the humans, especially that, we've been seeing a lot of the disinformation being perpetuated by political and public figures that, outside of the social media or the digital sphere are still problematic. And with that, I want to move on to Marwa. You did say that TikTok was a tool, or social media platforms are tools, but as has become evident over the last 8 months, they served as important tools to overcome the power imbalance and the tight control over the information system. And they were probably the only spaces where marginalized and oppressed populations had some agency. And they've helped support some accountability efforts and documentation for the legal cases that we've seen, regardless of the shortcomings of those. So if you could, talk a little bit more about, do social media platforms have a responsibility here to provide, transparency and accountability? And I know you wanted to also touch on the AI targeting systems that Israel has been using as well. So I'll give you some time for that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tamara. Well, where should I begin? I'm often, as an activist, but then also as a civil society, actor, I often fluctuate between the fact that we're talking about American big tech. There's, to Mark's point, the bias is so inherent and embedded in the structures that I don't know if there is ever hope that these big platforms will ever regard Palestinians as on an equal footing with powerful actors. But then and there are often calls from activists that we should boycott these platforms, but there are no alternatives. You've mentioned Blue Sky and Mastodon. Those don't have that network effect that would allow people to share information as widely as possible. So in the lack of other alternatives, I think we do need to hold these companies accountable, and they do have responsibilities. So do they have responsibilities to ensure people's safety and respect their rights? Absolutely. Now, these are obviously private actors, right? So the duty to respect and promote human rights falls squarely on governments, but it's been made repeatedly clear by a number of UN special rapporteurs on freedom of expression that because of their outsized power, they do quasi have the same responsibilities as states, and particularly when it comes to freedom of expression. So the UN guiding principles on business and human rights also makes it very clear for platforms and for actually private companies at large that they do need to mitigate any human rights risks associated with their actions, with their policies and their services, and particularly in situations of armed conflict. When they're operating in a conflict area, as in as in Gaza right now, they need to conduct heightened human rights due diligence in order to ensure that their services and their products are not contributing to, directly linked to mass atrocities or gross human rights abuses. So companies like Google, for instance, to the point of around lack of transparency here, the onus is on the company to prove that they're not being complicit in atrocity crimes. And they need to do the assessment themselves and then consequently terminate the contract with the Israeli government because of the well-documented crimes upon crimes upon crimes we see, and the fact that the ICJ had made it clear that there is an imminent and plausible risk of the crime of genocide committed by Israel against the Palestinian people in Gaza. So we're not talking about theoretical, even if platforms, let's say, or tech companies do not want to take Palestinians' word for it, there is that already legal assessment existing that there is that serious risk. Not surprisingly, but frustratingly, none of the platforms we've asked very specific questions around, like, after the ICJ ruling, what's your human rights due diligence? What have you done? And the answer is just complete silence. Now, Laura made a very excellent point about the collective impact of violations, certain violations, for example, mass surveillance. Another one that comes to mind is the collective sum of Israeli disinformation and war propaganda. When you talk to, for example, Google or Meta about targeted advertisements, so all the Israeli ads we saw in the beginning of the war, the company says, it assesses this single piece of content and tells you, well, it doesn't violate any of our rules. Because, for example, that one ad with rainbows, like animated ad with rainbows and a children sleeping lullaby, it doesn't violate Google's or YouTube's policy ads. But what companies fail to do, and the same case with, if you scroll down the IDF's Facebook page, you'll see, tons of disinformation. And these companies just look at that one specific piece of content and say, well, there are no explicit violations and therefore should remain up. But what they fail to do is to look at the collective impact of such disinformation and targeted ads. And essentially, as we see now, is the death of over 35,000 Palestinians and the almost complete destruction of the Gaza Strip. That is justified, especially in the beginning and with the stories of sexual violence and beheaded babies and targeting UNRWA and targeting Palestinian hospitals, et cetera, that those are basically the weapons and the tools that Israel uses to distract from those crimes, to distract public opinion, to distract journalists and to mislead them, who are also happy to play the role of scenographers, unfortunately, and to justify those crimes. And so I think in terms of regulation, it is really time to end the era of self-regulation for tech platforms and for social media companies in specific. It is really time to make those assessments mandatory and transparent, and to force companies to correct course and adjust based on the findings of these assessments. Lastly, I want to say, on the technologies, Laura and Sausan mentioned, we take a slightly different approach to those. When we looked at the lavender and the gospel, what we found is that they're not necessarily they're not sophisticated technologies. They're actually systems that have existed in multiple countries, in many countries. There are similar to, predictive policing tools or, systems that, for example, can assess and generate predictions around whether a certain person can commit a crime again if used in the court, or, if a certain neighborhood needs to, or a certain person may commit a crime in the future, or certain neighborhoods need to be policed or have strong police presence. And these systems, of course, have issues around accuracy, and they need to have oversight. But even if, let's say, for argument's sake, that those systems had proper oversight, that you had Israeli soldiers looking into the Lavender's kill list and going through them one by one, I think here the issue is that that system is working precisely as Israel wants it to be. It's not really just an issue of lack of human oversight. And therefore, we just called for their total ban. Like predictive systems used to that effect, in the case of Gaza, to assess the likelihood of a person being Hamas militant or an Islamic Jihad militant, or they're used in the US to predict whether a Black neighborhood should be have police patrols going to their neighborhood, or to a person appearing before courts if they're going to commit a crime, and based on that assessing their judgment. So these systems need to be banned in times of war, in times of peace, because of their far-reaching human rights impacts. And in Gaza, we see really just the epitome of the level of dystopian level that these systems can take us to. So I'll end here. Back to you, Tamara.
Thank you, Marwa. And on this note of banning those AI targeting systems and the era of self-regulation for social media platforms, I want to move on to Sausan. And Sausan, I'd like to ask you about what efforts and international frameworks exist to counter the dangers of AI in warfare. And do you have any recommendations for ensuring human rights and civilian protection in this context?
Thank you, Tamara. Yes, so sort of how Laura mentioned and how we mentioned in the introduction is that there has been a campaign and a coalition efforts that have been advocating for a legally binding instrument to control the use of autonomous weapon systems, or the development and use of autonomous weapon systems, essentially since 2013. And this campaign was co-founded by Human Rights Watch and other international non-governmental organizations. And what we see is that for the past decade, that discussions on the need to regulate these autonomous weapon systems have been taking place in the Convention on Conventional Weapons, or the CCW, but with repeated failure, unfortunately. And this was since 2014. And this is primarily because the CCW does operate by consensus, which means that a handful or even one state can object to efforts for negotiation. And oftentimes the states have included Australia, China, Iran, Israel, Russia, et cetera, US, and the UK. And these are all countries that we know are heavily investing in military applications of artificial intelligence. But one thing that we do see is that, 2 days before the October 7th war, is that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, called on states and called on world leaders to launch a negotiation for a legally binding instrument by 2026. And later in December, a couple months later, the UN General Assembly voted on the first resolution on autonomous weapon systems, which is the first resolution in the UNGA. But one thing that is important to note is that when we think about these weapon systems or these AI generative tools of target generations, these tools wouldn't necessarily fall under the framework or in the guidelines of this call for an international legally binding instrument. So similar to what Marwa and Mark said, there's still concerns to be had and still voiced and questions to be asked about these weapon systems. And when it comes to these AI tools, one thing that we do need is greater transparency and also accountability when it comes to how Israel is developing and how Israel is using these weapons or these tools in the current war. And this includes, what types of data are these systems using or to develop the ratings or to generate this target list, and how and when did Israel collect this data, or what is the data itself? And also, what is the detail of the extent of the human supervision or control over these weapon systems? And also, can the Israeli officials explain how the AI target generation or targeting tools are operated? And just to go back to Mark's point and Marwa's point too, the thing is that we know is that human control is not always enough. And that's something that is being debated, within these coalitions and within these organizations. But it's also important to note that digital dehumanization itself does not occur in a vacuum, right? Digital dehumanization at the end of the day is dehumanization. So, I like to think of it as just physical dehumanization, sometimes translated or coded into an algorithm or translated onto a motherboard. And, when we think about in all of these systems, the question should be, what are we doing to target that dehumanization, not just digital dehumanization? Now, one thing, going back to the call to negotiate a legally binding instrument and having these AI targeting tools not necessarily fall within the frameworks of the treaty, is that a lot of times when we do think about killer robots or fully lethal autonomous weapon systems, sometimes we do think about drone swarms armed and just ready to shoot. But one thing that these tools are highlighting is that humans are and will continue to find ways to leverage AI, right, to establish new patterns and, Mark, like you said, new thresholds for violence. And this is something that I think should be the most concerning for us. And as of now, there's no doubt that digital dehumanization and also, the automation of violence does fall disproportionately on Palestinians living under occupation, but also on Black and Brown people all around the world. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that while this is happening in Israel and while this is happening in Palestine and in the Gaza, we live in a very much globalized military industrial complex, right? And one thing that this complex almost guarantees is that these weapons and these weapons designs are never really confined within a geographical border. And, we know that Israel is one of the world's top 10 exporters of arms exporters. So, and it's profited from the testing of these weapon systems and from the testing of these new AI tools around the world. And this has developed, what they call field tested or combat proven systems that use Palestinian territories and also Gaza as what, is a laboratory. And, without the treaty or without any legally binding instrument or even regulation, there is no guarantee that Israel will not, sell these weapons elsewhere and export not just the weapon systems itself, but also this brand of automated violence. And, Marwa, you mentioned that, is there ever a chance that, Palestinians will be able to be regarded on what we call like equal footing? Like, is there any chance for us to push through this treaty? And while it does seem very much we're on the losing end of these negotiations or things are moving slowly, and while weapons developments are being developed at exponential rate that are far outpassing these negotiations, one thing that we can look at is that past humanitarian disarmament treaties, right? We've seen how a small number of committed, not just states, but also individuals and organizations have been able to influence not just the weapons that are used, but also how wars are fought themselves. And, people that do suffer from digital dehumanization now, people in Gaza and also Palestinians and people all around the world that suffer from not just digital dehumanization, but also the abstraction of violence and also the automation of harm, have a major role to play in pushing for these new regulations. And not just by necessarily offering perspectives or narratives of harm, but I think also from being active players in an international or global norm setting. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Tamara.
Okay, thank you, Sausan. And you've mentioned that it's very likely that humans and especially for-profit companies are going to continue to leverage AI to devise new ways for violence. And here I want to move to Laura and maybe ask you a little bit about the larger picture, the big tech. And in your opinion, how should tech companies be held accountable for their role, or be, how should we counter those efforts in developing more technologies, AI-assisted warfare that are contributing to atrocities and violations around the world? And just in addition to that, I know we've been seeing some dissent, individual group dissent within the tech industry. There's Googlers against genocide, there's Meta mates for ceasefire, no tech for apartheid, and there's a continuous crackdown and suspensions and firing. But how influential are these groups and efforts within the tech industry? Laura?
Yes. So as for how I think that tech companies should be held accountable for their role in automated warfare, I believe we should have binding international regulations that can be used to hold them to account. I already mentioned that I perceive that there's a sort of gap in international law around mass population level surveillance or mass surveillance based on personal characteristics. I think if we should ban automated targeting, as Mara says, but we should also ban the mass surveillance that is required to make automated targeting work and predictive policing as well. So identifying breaches and holding the companies to account would still be an issue, but it's not totally impossible. We have seen the EU and to some extent the US holding big tech to account over competition issues and other kinds of issues. So it's not possible. It's a matter of will. So I do think that dissenters and ethical objectors in companies are to be applauded, but making the appropriate international law really empowers potential whistleblowers. It's rather difficult to blow the whistle over a moral issue that doesn't clearly breach a law or a rule of some kind. But if there is a very clear law or rule that is being breached, It gives whistleblowers the power to sort of gather evidence that shows that and submit that evidence to some relevant authority. So it gives them a much clearer path forward than simply sort of airing sort of moral concerns. So as been mentioned previously, there is currently a movement towards regulation of lethal autonomous weapon systems, but this does exclude both surveillance and decision support systems such as Lavender and Hasbara that are not housed within weapons, like Susan says. These, of course, I think are still a problem. You know, as mentioned before, effective human supervision is an unsolved problem in human factors. So in effect, it is to hand over control. And as Mark points out, sometimes the operators do not have an interest in reducing violence against innocent targets. So, but the benefit of having clear rules about this is that it makes it more clear that the humans in the chain of command are accountable. And I think keeping that clarity is really important. As for the influence of groups within the tech industry, like I say, I really applaud the people who are stepping up to speak out against these things. It is a very, very different time to when I did that in Google in 2017, 2018. Tech firms have been retrenching on their hiring. At that time, they were much keener to hire people, significantly less keen to lose staff, and that has sort of flipped around. So in general, it feels like employees have got less power now than then. As far as I'm aware, nobody was fired for protesting about Maven at Google. I fired myself, but Google has fired many people in relation to Nimbus. The gloves are off. You know, and as I mentioned before, companies have also gotten much better at hiding their tracks about sort of morally objectionable projects that are happening. So it's an uphill battle. You know, I do see organizing happening, which is very important. I think the more organized that employees can be, the more that they can act as a bloc, the more power they will have. I mean, this is something that labor organizers have known for a long time. I think the fact that we're finally seeing a move towards more unionizing and more organizing in general in tech is a very bright spot in these kinds of dark times. But still, I think that the most power that employees will have is the power to blow the whistle in response to a clear breach of some pretty well-defined rule or law. So I think that you know, regulators and the rest of us need to do our part in pushing for that.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to all of you for these really interesting, enlightening, very important remarks. I want to give the chance to Will Youmans from George Washington University to make some comments as well here and ask a question or two to the panelists. Will?
Thank you all for the enriching panel discussion. I learned so much from all of you, and we really touched on a wide breadth of topics that I actually don't have much in terms of comments, but I do have lots of questions. But because of how much time we have, I think I'll just focus on one particular question. I think there was a little bit of discussion about consumer activism. I mean, I think in one or two comments, the idea, like, you know, it'd be difficult for consumers to boycott, for example, some of these companies because of how ubiquitous they are in our lives and how dependent we are upon them, including as activists. But I'm curious if we could talk a little bit more about like the divestment movement, and to what extent do we see divestment activism as one way to create some sort of localized forums for bringing up these sorts of issues, because divestment activists are focusing on the institutions that they're part of and governments, or local governments, whereas, you know, international treaties is not something that's so accessible for localized activists. But if we could, I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how your analysis that you brought up today could be integrated into divestment activism. Like, what kind of companies should they be targeting outside of the obvious offenders of the weapons industry, for example? So it's just sort of an open question for the panel.
Okay, thank you, Will. And I'll add my question here as well, which is the flip side to that. Will asked about consumer activism, and many of you mentioned that we have to put the responsibility back on the regulators. But also, some of you mentioned that there's no political will, especially when it comes to the situation in Palestine. And there's this kind of narrative of, if we don't do it, then we're losing the tech war to China, and this great power competition where others will step in and take over. So these two questions about consumer activism: how can we make sure that regulators do their jobs in protecting international law and human rights, when we know that many of them are not motivated? And we'll do another round of answers. We have about 10 minutes left, so maybe a couple of minutes each. And I think we can do the same order. Start with Mark.
Yeah, so yeah, thanks for the questions. And again, it was great hearing from everyone. And I'm also lucky to have someone who worked in the tech industry here. I think that they'd be able to give some insights into this. But I mean, I don't know. I think divestment generally as a strategy is a good thing. I think with the tech companies, I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, I encourage divestment, but I focus resources on actually encouraging politically to enforce antitrust laws. So I don't think it's that. I think with technology companies, it's going to be really hard to get a sustained divestment campaign. And we have to remember, like 7 of the top 10 most capitalized countries in the world are big tech companies, right? The amount of resources they have is huge. So I don't know if divestment, I reckon political pressure to engage in antitrust, break up those larger companies into smaller companies would be more effective, because once you have those smaller companies, I think they would be more responsive to potential divestment campaigns down the road. That's just sort of my brief point on that. And I don't necessarily know. I just think divesting from tech in terms of social media is a different beast. Just as an update, I think, just because this relates to what I talked about before, Meta released their threat analysis report today, just now. And the anti-UNRWA campaign that I mentioned has been attributed to a political marketing firm in Israel, which is interesting. And Facebook or Meta have sent a cease and desist to them. But just again, on these kind of tech regulations, when we look at the ecosystem of disinformation, it is, yes, these platforms often form the large body of the infrastructure. But why is it that a country allows a political marketing firm or PR company to engage in forms of behavior that are fundamentally dishonest? This is something that I think governments also need to factor in when it comes to this. And I say this every time I get asked this, there's supply chains of disinformation, and tech firms are part of that supply chain, and that must also be disrupted. But there's other elements along the way that also need to be divested from or regulated.
Thank you, Mark. Marwa, last comments.
Yeah, I agree with Mark. I don't see how consumer divestment from social media companies would help. Some Palestinian activists tried in the past to boycott, or they tried to mark Meta, for instance, on app stores as 1 star, just to try and create some pressure. I mean, they can maybe they can create some pressure, but really it's often contained, because again, these platforms have billions of users. So in order to have that impact on them, you need to have a mass exodus from these. But there are things that we can do, maybe not necessarily as consumers, but as activists, as maybe investors. If there are people who invest in companies, there are different mechanisms where you can use your voice and use certain spaces to put more pressure on companies and to demand transparency and accountability. So investor advocacy would be an interesting accountability venue, although it's also not straightforward. Now, in terms of regulation, honestly, if you asked me this question before October 7th, I would have said, yes, people need to demand certain regulations. But after October 7th, I think democracies, Western liberal democracies, are seriously flawed. The will of people does not translate into actual policies or laws. And in the US right now, there's been a paralysis over tech regulation for God knows how many years. And I don't think that this issue would be solved. So maybe at a federal level, at a state level, at least in the US side. Yeah, I don't know about the regular. I think there's definitely more role for civil society to continue their advocacy work. Maybe another idea, just to give concrete recommendations, is I think we need to be highly alert about the possible export of these Israeli technologies to the rest of the world, because we know that after every war, Israel sells or expands its sales of and transfer of these technologies, given that they were battle tested. And so we need to monitor what these companies are and call for either their ban or like pressure their investors to divest. And if they're publicly procured, then pressure the public entities procuring them. So there's a long list of things that people can do. It's difficult, but it's possible.
Thank you, Marwa, for these concrete recommendations. And next we have Sausan. Last statements or answers to these questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but I do completely agree with Marwa in terms of tracking, who is buying these weapons or where these weapons are going afterwards. I mean, even before the war is still ongoing, and we see that Israeli companies are already selling their drones and facial recognition scanning technology to police departments across the US. And this has been something that's been happening for a while. But I do think that, when it comes to companies and when it comes to not just weapons manufacturers, but also companies like Amazon or like Google, or like you said, where it's this black box of what's really going on, I think the best thing that we can do, not just as civil society, but I guess also as concerned citizens, is just raise the alarm and ask questions really loudly, right? It's like we need more accountability, we need more transparency. And I think the only way that we're going to get that is by asking the questions that we need answers to, right? How is the data obtained? How is the data used? Can you explain how these weapons work? And by constantly asking those questions, I think that not just shows our concerns, but eventually people will have to listen, and these companies will have to listen and respond. But yeah, that's what I would add.
Thank you, Sausan. And Laura, if you want to answer any of these questions and provide some last comments.
Yeah, I would echo Susan's points there. I mean, we need to demand more transparency about how weapon systems and all sorts of these other systems of concern, such as the surveillance systems and predictive policing and all of these kinds of systems work or would work. We can't simply just accept them. I do think I would add some extra comments on some previous points about the challenges of divestment in the tech industry. We have the very, very large tech companies based in the US. As previously pointed out, they're so large it is very difficult to make any significant impact on them through sort of divestment pressures or shareholder activism, indeed. And then with smaller companies, you tend to have the opposite problem in that they are typically completely privately owned and not publicly traded. There's been a trend in recent years towards smaller tech companies kind of pushing back their IPOs for as long as possible. So we have very many quite large and well-established technology companies now that have not yet IPO'd. And many of them, and this would include many of the smaller companies like the likes of Rebellion Defense and these kinds of new wave tech companies. Most of these are private as well. And then, of course, in the social media space, we have a significant presence from TikTok, which of course is a Chinese company, and like most Chinese companies, that is completely fully private and not publicly traded either. So it's very difficult to apply those kinds of pressures there. So on that depressing note, I will hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I was hoping for a hopeful note at the end, but I think that's the reality that we're dealing with when it comes to the role of technology in crises and warfare. And with that, we have really come to the end of our time for this webinar. Thanks to all of you, our panelists, for your excellent insights. I have certainly learned a lot. Thank you for your time and contributions, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. On behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C. and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University, thank you all for your time. Please follow our work, and the video will be available on our website at arabcenterdc.org. Thank you again, and take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank